Um, you are now being recorded, so off you go.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. It's the dreaded post-lunch session, but it's only 1 o'clock, so hopefully this will um not be too soporific. Those of you who've done one or two ancient history courses know that I've got sources that I do a sort of little talk on sources that I think should be on the spec, which are not on the spec. And this is a different kind of iteration of the same theme, really. Um, one of the real problems that we have is that the lack of diversity in lots of different ways actually on the both GCSE and A level history, but ancient history syllabus, but I'm talking here about ancient history A level. And that could just be actually the balance between literary and archaeological sources. But I'm going to be focusing today on a different way of looking at diversity, which is the sort of 80% of population who are not adult male citizens, probably more than 80%. And where do they fit in the Greek period study? I have got a dog with me who's very excited. So if you hear any noise, that's what's going on there. So thought I'd start with the taking analogy with the Ukraine war. Um, Obviously, this has been going on for over 2 years now. And when we're reading about it or hearing about it in the media, there's probably two angles that we learn about. We learn about the kind of geopolitical element, and that's a really big factor. So, what is Putin trying to do? What is, Zelensky sort of famously here, just in his t-shirt. He doesn't really want to wear a suit. And then we've got the sort of engagement with world leaders and the West trying to support him. Okay, so all of this is important. What we also have, though, of course, a lot on our screens are the sort of human cost of all of this. So just taking these photos, they're trying to symbolize something that the experience of children and women in war zones. On the left, top left, refugees, top right, because of the war. And then at the bottom, the kind of experience of the ordinary soldier, not looking at it from the geopolitical level, but just like what is it like on the ground for an ordinary Ukrainian or even a Russian, conscripted soldier to just be in that war zone. And I would say that ancient history historically has done this, ad infinitum. Ancient history has loved doing geopolitics, doing the war in politics, and still that is the case. We have a massive overhang of this philosophy, which is a kind of very, I think, Victorian set of priorities going into the 20th century. How do we study ancient history? What's it all about? Well, it's to help us understand how the great powers work, etc. And I find it massively frustrating because I don't think ancient history as a subject historically has done anything like enough. Of course, I don't think, I know it hasn't, to look at these perspectives. And Danny Packnell gave a great talk in the CA conference back in March, where he said, actually, what are our students expecting? They're expecting to kind of see what they see, in the news around them, and perhaps experience in their own lives. Hopefully not. But they expect this stuff to be in their history and ancient history syllabuses as well. And it simply isn't an ancient history anything like enough. And so there's two elements really. I mean, one is that, as many of you will be aware, we're trying to really to redevelop the spec so that this stuff gets in there and is studied, and we have questions around this aspect of, war and politics if we're going to do war and politics. But I think, in a more limited way, what I'm trying to do today is talk about how you can just use the current specs, and just get this stuff in there so that you can open up those conversations. I do also want to say that I have two slides about sexual violence in war, and I will let you know when they're coming. If you wish either to, take 3 minutes out, then obviously that's quite understood, and I'll warn you, or just be aware that I will be putting up two slides which engage with, from the ancient world, sources that engage with sexual violence during warfare. So, very simply, actually, this is a wonderful resource. So I will make sure that the slides are made available. But we learn about Athens builds a navy, we learn about Salamis, we learn about the Athenian Empire. But how much do we actually think about what the experience is like for your average rower on the fleet? The spec doesn't invite you very much to do that. There is, however, this wonderful short 14, 15-minute video of the ship, the trireme Olympias, which was built in the 1980s to try and reconstruct a Greek trireme. And I show it in my class. I'm just going to show a little bit of it here. So we will just go forward a little bit and just have a look at, the opening bits of it. Because it's a fantastic insight into what it's like.
This video was made during trials of the reconstruction of an ancient Athenian trireme warship at Poros, Greece, in August 1990. Here we see some of the naval school at Poros and the town of Poros behind, as the camera moves to show the ship, Olympias, moored to the quay stern first in Mediterranean fashion.
So then what they do is they go on to look at, as I said, it's only just over 14 minutes. They look at the kind of trials and the tactics, like how quickly can you go? What's it like to be rowing? How easy is it to turn the ship? So we just have a little bit of that as well.
Various methods of giving the time for oar strokes suggested by ancient writers have been tried, but due to the short time available for such trials as these in the modern world, the rowing master gives his orders and the time by a microphone with speakers distributed around the ship.
Okay, let's get the nice cabin out here.
Oar blades are only 30 centimeters apart in the water, so good timing and synchronization are essential if blades are not to clash. This is the first thing every new crew has to learn. Rate of striking rises to about 45 strokes per minute in a sprint, as will be seen later.
So, I mean, I could go on, but that is a wonderful video. And either you could set it for homework or you could, show some or all of it during a lesson. But just that idea of what's it like for your ordinary soldier or sailor, the majority of Athenian citizens are going to be rowing on triremes. And just the techniques. I mean, I had a girl, and my classes, when I show them, they're transfixed by that video. I had a girl last term when I was showing it, she's a rower. And it's probably fair to say she sometimes switches off in lessons, but she was absolutely gripped and then wanted to talk about how this relates to, her own experience of rowing. So again, just like that's not Themistocles, that's just your ordinary Athenian. And it's a really simple way of bringing the course alive, I think. Things that you could then bring in alongside that. This is in the Acropolis Museum. You might well be familiar with it. It's just a bit of archaeological evidence from the trireme Paralos, which is a state trireme. It's mentioned in a prescribed source by Xenophon. It's kind of the most important ship. It's sort of the Royal Yacht Britannia or whatever. That's probably not a great analogy. But again, you can kind of see the same movement going on as you've just seen in that video. What I'm also trying to do here is give you other tools, and I hope this is going to open up okay. So what have we got here? This is a really fantastically interesting inscription, I think. As it says here, it's from Attic Inscriptions Online, so it's freely available. List of crew of Athenian triremes. So this is about the only list I think they have of trireme crews, dates from right at the end of our study period. And if you scroll down, which I'm doing very quickly, and you come down to the notes here, there's some really great notes. So it says this is a list of trireme crews. The apparently full complements of 4 triremes are listed and part of a 5th. And the lettering gives us the date of the sort of this period at the end towards 400. But what I think is fascinating is that some of the names are clearly of slaves. So, for example, these are citizens or possibly metics. But once you get down to this list here, you've got manes of Caedistra. So as soon as you've got the of, it means belonging to. So we have evidence here of slaves also rowing the triremes. And we do learn through references around Aristophanes' frogs that towards the end of the war, they were having to bring slaves onto ships and then actually gave them their freedom, I think, after Arginusae. So there's some really good notes here again about slaves on the triremes, and I think I particularly highlight this bit. The 169 slaves listed on this inscription account for almost half the real-life slaves attested in Athens and are important evidence for slave naming patterns. So this opens a conversation, this inscription, or maybe with the video of who's actually rowing these boats. You've got slaves possibly alongside their masters or other or Athenian citizens, for example. You can open a conversation about slavery, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. I just think it's a kind of wonderful way to get them thinking in a more diverse way about what those ships were like. Okay, so if we then come to the evacuation of Athens in 480, Herodotus says very little about it apart from they evacuated it, but we actually get more detail. This is not a prescribed source in Plutarch's biography of Themistocles. And this is just a really interesting passage. In particular, it says, as soon as the decree was passed, most of the Athenians sent their wives and children to Troezen, that's in the Peloponnese, where the citizens vied with one another in welcoming them. They even voted to maintain the refugees at the public expense. They gave each family 2 obols a day, allowed the children to pick fruit wherever they pleased as soon as it was ripe, which I think is a really wonderful insight, and went so far as to pay schoolmasters to teach them. So I think, again, this opens up conversations. You know, the Ukraine war, I mean, obviously the media around immigration and refugees is generally very negative, but actually we do have a positive example in the last 2 years of the way, I think, in which Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed into Britain, but other European countries. And, you know, they have been given education. They have been looked after to some extent at the public expense through payments to families who are housing them, etc. So there's something really rich there, I think, about you know, exploring those connections and thinking about how you support war refugees, I guess, particularly when it's your side that you're trying to help. So that is a really rich one from that period. So my next slide is about sexual violence. So if you don't want to be looking at that, please do just take 3 minutes out for just a bit of a warning of what is to come. Therefore, I think that you know, as students might say, you might not want to be pushing them at them, obviously. And I strongly believe when it comes to issues of violence and perhaps particularly sexual violence, each teacher should be empowered to know their own context. No one should be forced to teach this. I don't think it should be a kind of compulsory part of the syllabus. It should be there for a teacher to understand their own context. But you might have a question where a student says, well, hang on a minute, we're reading about these terrible acts of sexual violence in Ukraine, other parts of the world at the moment. Why do we not know about this, or why do we not hear about this in the ancient world? Well, the truth is we do. It's just that those sources have not been highlighted. It's also true that the authors probably haven't taken them terribly seriously. But this is a short passage from Herodotus where he talks about the Persian march south towards Athens in 480. The Persians are marching through Phocis, and he gives all the details. And I'll just leave you to read the quotation here, which is very grim. Give you just 30 seconds to read that. So again, you know, each of you knows your context and knows if and how it's appropriate to bring in this sort of content. But I think we should be aware as teachers that, you know, it is there. And as I said, you know, when children, young people are seeing these sorts of issues raised in the media about modern warfare, it's dishonest to pretend that it's not there in ancient warfare. And so I'd sort of encourage you to have this up your sleeve in case someone asks, or something like this up your sleeve, in case someone asks about this topic. Now, obviously, war crimes was not a deep concern of ancient authors. And so, as here, we normally have these events mentioned only in passing, in quite a glib way, but they are there. And I think it's important to be able to acknowledge that as teachers, if we are asked about that. So, perhaps another side of the coin, it's very understandable to see particularly women and children as, if you like, the first victims of war, non-combatants. But I think there's also a really interesting source in Herodotus about how kind of war makes everyone crazy. And so in the winter, I'm trying to do this semi-chronologically. So this is the next spring after 480. And essentially the Persians are trying to get the Athenians to come over to the Persian side. They offer them quite good terms. They've already sent down Alexander. The Athenians have said no. They send down another Greek from Asia Minor. And actually, someone called Lycidas, an Athenian, he stands up and says, maybe we should think about this. So one of the counselors, a man named Lycidas, expressed the opinion that the best course would be to admit the proposals which Murakaides brought. So this is this sort of Persian ambassador who's Greek, and to submit them for approval to the General Assembly of the people. So he says, come on, we need to give in to the Persians. We need to work with them. The Athenians were so enraged when they heard it that they surrounded Lycidas and stoned him to death. So even the thought of it, you know, brings out this incredibly violent response. But then Herodotus goes on to say, the Athenian women soon find out what had happened, whereupon, without a word from the men, and I think that's interesting, there's no encouragement, this is of their own volition, they got together and flocked to Lycidas's house and stoned his wife and children. So, I mean, you can take this source in all sorts of different directions, but I think just the idea that war brutalizes everyone, and perhaps leads or can lead anyone and everyone to do terrible things. Again, we have that evidence in there in the sources, but it's not been prioritized historically in this subject. So coming on to my second sexual violence slide here, which probably starts off being a little bit more mirthful. So just if you don't want to look at it, just take a couple of minutes out. But this is called the Eurymedon vase. And if you do show this in class, and I have done so, the first reaction is just kind of mirth and laughter and giggling and all the rest of it. It's two sides of the same pot. It shows basically a Greek man holding his penis and a Persian man bending over for him, as you can see. And the inscription says, I am Eurymedon, I stand bent forward. Now, actually, there's lots of academic scholarship about what this is really, what event this is about. Most people would say it does commemorate the Athenian victory at the Battle of Eurymedon. I think it's dated to the 460s, which is the same time. And it's clearly a very kind of triumphalist Athenian vase celebrating a victory. This is interesting from a couple of angles. One is it's just taking out the sexual side of it, just an interesting idea about Athenian triumphalism, mocking the Persians, ridiculing the Persians. But I think also what, from a kind of sexual violence point of view, it starts off with them having a good old laugh, as you would imagine. But then those conversations do start to become richer and more complex about, you know, why is a sex act symbolic of a military victory? You know, what is the link between sexual violence and military violence? So I think, again, in the right context, this vase can really add something to your classes. And it's also, interestingly, evidence for a very, very poorly recorded battle of Eurymedon. So coming down the time span a bit, Thucydides has got a very big woman problem. So I've put in there a Simone de Beauvoir quotation. And Thucydides is like the sort of ultimate not interested in women historian. And I think as teachers, we actually need to acknowledge that. That is really important. So, you know, some of my stats here, only 20 references to women in his whole text and 6 named women. Okay. Herodotus is actually very different, names 381. More than a third of his named characters are women. So we're dealing with something very different here. Women generally are referred to in the plural with the term women and children. During the plague account, for example, obviously women would have suffered just as much as men during the plague. They're not mentioned once in any sort of group. They probably were doing caregiving, etc. You do get mention of dogs, though. Good example of, you know, his attitude to women is a short passage from the civil war in Corcyra in 427. He says, the women also joined in the fighting with great daring, hurling down tiles from the rooftops and standing up to the din of battle with a courage beyond their sex. So a throwaway remark that the women joined the fighting as well, and they behave like men, essentially, which is quite surprising. So this is a really big problem. And as I said, I think we really need to say that to our students, and to acknowledge that. And you know, how do you get around that? Well, I think one obvious way, because students might ask, and I teach an all-girls school, so probably even more, well, weren't women actually, how are they experiencing the war? Because we don't get it in Thucydides. So really obvious ways, we'll go to Lysistrata. It's written in 411 in the middle of the war. It's clearly a reaction and response to the war. Yes, it's written by a man for an almost entirely male audience with male actors. But even then, it must be, Aristophanes is always challenging his citizen audience, with difficult issues of the day. And I just can't believe that he isn't putting forward ideas which they're not dealing with in they are dealing with in their everyday life. So famous quote here from Lysistrata, basically just saying, you always screw up, you always make stupid mistakes. In the assembly today, what did you decide to inscribe on the stone under the peace of treaty? And what did my husband say? Shut up and mind your own business. And I did. So I kept quiet, but sure enough, next thing I knew, you take an even sillier decision. And then we might go so far as to ask, husband, why are you men persisting with this stupid policy? Whereupon he'd glare at me and say, back to your spinning, woman, or you'll have a headache for a month. Let war be the care of menfolk. So again, if you want to, you can explore the idea of physical violence, of domestic violence there. But this just has the ring of truth of it, that why would men in an audience find this funny or thought-provoking if it wasn't part of their lived experience of their wives complaining about the fact that they were off at war, their sons were dying, their husbands were dying. Again, I won't play this for very long. There's a wonderful 2-minute OU cartoon which just outlines the plot. There's one on Lysistrata and there's one on Persians. So I'll show you 10 seconds of this.
To put an end to the Peloponnesian War, Lysistrata persuades women from all over Greece.
So you can come and explore that one as well. So another episode, the sort of horror of this war, Milos in 416-15. Thucydides says at the end of that debate, the Melians surrendered unconditionally to the Athenians, who put to death all the men of military age, whom they took, and sold the women and children as slaves. And that's, again, just a cursory reference. If you want to explore that more, then the following year, Euripides writes a play called Trojan Women, which some have seen as a response to this particular event, others just to the war in general. And you get, I've picked one of any number of sections that I could have chosen here, but you've got Hecuba lamenting her fate. This is obviously set during a Trojan War, but this is a woman who is being taken off into slavery, having been a free and noble woman. So again, you can just show that to your students as kind of saying, well, these issues of enslaving people who are free, this is part of their drama at this period. And as well, if you just want to look at, see if that will work. If you want to look at slavery more general, there's another really good source from this period, dating, well, so it's 414, but it's after the mutilation of the Herms and the profaning of the mysteries, which is, of course, mentioned in the period study, and it's part of understanding why Alcibiades was recalled. And there is, these are the sales, property confiscated, and people condemned from people who were condemned for mutilating the Herms. And again, very famous source this, although it's not on the period study or the depth study, to my massive, I just can't tell you how frustrated I am. But there's a metic called Cephisidorus. He has his property, oopsie, didn't want to do that. He has his properties confiscated, and there's a whole list of different slaves who are part of his property, and their value, and where they're from, their gender, their age, etc. Again, with some really good notes here. So again, just to get your students thinking and realizing that, slaves are not just these things that are mentioned in passing, and to be able to explore that, I think, is really important. I was only going to put this in at the end. I think we're nearly at time. I have talked about this elsewhere. There's a really interesting memorial for the war dead in 460, 459. I'm conscious leaving time for questions, but this is on this link here. What's interesting about it is it relates to the trip to Egypt, and in particularly, this is one tribe's war dead for the year, so you can think about war memorials. and whether they are really senior figures in the tribe or just ordinary people, they're just named by their own name. There's nothing to kind of, distinguish them. So there's a kind of sense of equality there. And it might have been part of a series of slabs. Okay, so those are just a few ideas. I'm conscious I've just dropped my phone, but we've got 2 minutes. I'm very happily share those slides. Those are sort of ways in which you can get in. I'm conscious I haven't got in issues around disability, and I'd very much like to try and explore that as well. But essentially, women, children, and slaves are the majority of the population, and they're just not there, unfortunately, in any of our syllabuses at the moment. There are just some sort of starters, if you like, for how you could open those conversations with the Greek period study. Thank you. Questions? Silence.
Let me just check if there's anything in the chat for you as well. Any questions there? And if not, I'll stop the recording now. And yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
No questions. Right, I will stop the recording.